I am here because Washington needs fighters, and Graham Platner is the fighter we need. You bet. I said to myself, that's my kind of man. Because that is a man who not only has the values, but a man who believes in accountability. And we need a little accountability coming out of Washington right now. We need Graham Platner to come in and get rid of the corruption in Washington. Time for new laws.
He was heavily intoxicated, had intentions with me, and wasn't listening when I said no. And
you were saying, no, don't, over and over.
I remember, obviously I've had to recall a lot of this. This is something that I tried for many years to forget. And so small details, might get past me. But yes, I remember very specifically saying, I'm not into this. I remember that the most, sort of saying that the most firmly. I remember specifically him grabbing at my chest, and I hit his hand and I said, don't touch me. And I remember that during the altercation.
And then he kept going.
Yeah.
I know that you have been very reluctant to tell this story. Very reluctant.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised you're here.
Thrown up 3 times today.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Why did you ultimately decide to do it? Why come forward?
A few reasons. One of the biggest ones is that I think that there are a lot of men in this world relying on the silence of women.
I wanted to directly address the troubling, serious, and false allegations against me. Any accusation of non-consensual behavior is categorically false.
Hey everyone, it's Graham Platner here. I think as many of you know, over the past couple days, I have faced some very serious allegations, and I just want to make it clear. This is all false. The things that have been claimed did not happen. It's not real. We believe that for the movement to continue, it can't be me. And for that reason, we are suspending campaign operations. This is incredibly difficult because I know that some will think it's an admission of guilt, and it most certainly is not. We're not doing it because of the allegations, we're doing it because of the structures that are being taken away from us by those in power. We banded together, we did it the way that we were told we are supposed to make change. And we won. And now they are not going to let us have it.
Yeah, baby, it's episode 90 of The Whiners on July 9th, 2026. Jeff Norman and Ryan Milton with you as we always are on Thursday nights. Morgan is out tonight, but we're joined by our special guest, Michael Tracey, the great independent journalist. And he will be in New York City on July 14th doing a debate sponsored by the Soho Forum at a venue called the Sheen Center. What is that all about, Michael?
That is a debate I was asked to participate in several months ago now by the organizers of the Soho Forum, or the people who run it, which is a regular debate series in New York City. And after the uproar of the Epstein files, apparently they had wanted to do a Epstein-themed debate, or at least Gene Epstein, no relation, the guy who's in charge of it, wanted to do that. And I was actually doubtful that they would even find anybody who would be willing to debate me, because I had informally sought to debate or even just converse with anybody who takes a contrary position to me on the Epstein thing for quite some time. Intermediaries had even tried to set up debates with people who take a differing perspective, and almost invariably where it was unsuccessful. But evidently, they found this individual to debate me, who I gather is a professor at Pace University. So yeah, July 14th, Bastille Day. Feel free to come out if you happen to be in the area.
I wish I was going to be in that area. That sounds great. I live in North Carolina, and Ryan's in Austin, so maybe we'll have an opportunity to see a video of it if we're lucky.
Yeah, I think it should be streamed or on video someplace.
That's good. Well, here on The Winers, we sip wine while we chat, and tonight, in honor of Michael's supermodel status, I'm drinking Hot to Trot wine made by 14 Hands. It's a Washington State wine. It's
I know
a
that
nice
one.
blend. You know it? Yeah, a nice
Sure,
blend of
14
Merlot,
Hands.
Syrah. Very good. And what are you drinking tonight, Ryan?
So typically, Chardonnays are considered the MSG of wine, but the French ones tend to be a little bit different, and I'm much more of a fan of this one. It has more acidic qualities. It's a little bit more, I don't know, what do they say? It's the terroir, right? All the different techniques that go into that, but it doesn't have all of the extra chemistry that American Chardonnays have. So it's very tasty, costs a little more than yours. I highly recommend it though.
All right, don't even mention the price. It's too
won't.
intimidating
I won't.
for us normal people.
I'm sticking with water for now. Sorry to be lame, but there you have it.
At least you owned the lameness. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, before we came on, Michael, Ryan and I were talking about whether or not you drink, and I told him, I don't know if you remember, we hung out for a bit at I think it was called the Peace Ball in Washington, D.C. Do you remember that?
Oh,
event?
okay. Yeah. Okay, I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I hadn't put that together for some reason, but yes, I remember you now.
Yeah, you were with that nice young woman who I guess was your camera operator for the field reporting that you used to do for Glenn Greenwald. Yeah.
Yes.
So we chatted for a while, but I can't remember if you had a drink in your hand.
I'm sure I did. It would have been the only way to get through that event. I do drink. I mean, I don't tend to drink kind of just on my own day to day, like. But if I'm at some function or some social event, yeah, I'll typically drink.
Got it.
It's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, nothing against people who kind of like just drink on their own on like a work day or something, but
oh, good.
that's not my habit, at least yet. Although sometimes I think I should become an alcoholic or something, because it would probably make my life more exciting.
Well, maybe a little less stressful. I'd like to see a documentary sometime of a day in the life of Michael Tracey.
It would not be that interesting of a documentary.
No, maybe it's
It
all
would
in the
be a
head.
lot of
Maybe
me
you're-
sitting on a laptop.
Yeah, I
Researching.
guess so. Maybe a documentary of what's going on inside your mind. You tweeted up a storm today, that's for sure. A lot going on, it's very chaotic times that we live in, and about the only relief we have is to try to get rich with precious metals. What's the latest on that, Ryan?
Well, I wouldn't say try to get rich. I'm not sure that that's possible for us lowly citizens, but I was just thinking about all of these different things, right? You still have, everything was solved in the Middle East. Now it's not solved. Again, instability there and in Europe. Cryptocurrency, I was looking at that. Man, you have to have ice in your veins to get into that. Now they're talking more about a correction, because you have to use those terms so people don't get nervous with the AI bubble in the West, while China is basically just soaring with their DeepSeek and things like that. I was looking at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, because the president had been saying about 20 days ago, we're 4 weeks away. So we apparently have about 16 days of oil. So anyway, everything is just continuing instability. So maybe the alcoholism is a good idea, or gold.
If we're going to run out of oil in 16 days.
Well, I mean, the thing is,
We're not going to run out of wine, though, in 16 days.
That's right. That's right. So, and I stockpile wine, and I don't stockpile gold, but central banks stockpile gold. And again, it's because it's not tied to the variance of inflation. It's considered gold, silver, even assets, which will, increase in value over time. Precious metals serve as a steadying force to avert risk. So our beloved audience should go to whiners.gold. I hope you're showing it there on the screen. You are, to learn more about Goldco and diversifying their retirement with physical gold and silver. That's what I've done. And also how they can roll over their existing funds into a precious metal IRA, Jeff. As I say, they're very professional. They're not pushy. I went through that whole undercover investigation of them, and they were pretty legit. So, you know, we are partners with them. And whiners.gold, that's where people should go.
All right, very good. All right, Michael, let's get to it. You were talking about Jeffrey Epstein before and having a hard time getting people to debate you, but a lot of people have been giving you grief over it, calling you a misogynist and things along those lines. And now you are weathering the storm yet again with regard to Graham Platner. People go, oh, surprised. Look at Michael Tracey. Look what position he's taking. And I just want to say that I love the way you just don't care and you withstand it all. They call you a contrarian. I don't know how you feel about that label. It's sort of, I guess, may have the connotation that you're trying to be disagreeable. I don't like that connotation because I think you're quite sincere about it. How does it feel to be weathering the storm that you get from all this?
Yeah, I've never cared for the term contrarian just because it connotes some sort of arbitrariness in why it is that I might say a certain thing or take a certain angle on a subject journalistically, and also kind of implies a certain level of, like, you know, insincerity or
Right.
just wanting to provoke for its own sake. You know, those are not motives that I've ever able to consciously locate in my own head. Not that I couldn't be maybe fairly accused of having some maybe disagreeable personality traits, but yeah, I never do or say anything, you know, in terms of my public presentation that I can't give some kind of sincere argumentation for. And my argumentation for why I've taken this tack with Platner is that, you know, I personally never even had any particular political affinity with Platner.
Right.
But although, you know, it is sort of notable, let's say, that he was able to become the nominee for one of the two major parties in, like, the marquee Senate race in the country that could decide control of the chamber. So that alone is kind of like,
And it was a landslide too, right?
not only that, it was so, his lead was so overwhelming, or his command over the Democratic primary electorate was so overwhelming that the candidate who had been fielded by Schumer to potentially stop him, Janet Mills, who was the incumbent Democratic governor, she aborted her candidacy like at least a month or two in advance. So yeah, it was overwhelming. And she was still on the ballot, as you could see, but his political strength by you know the spring to early summer of 2026 was so insurmountable that it was seen as a lost cause for any, quote, establishment Democrat to even hope to beat him. So that is notable, right? And I don't know that I necessarily would therefore have an affinity with him because of that, but I at least would have some recognition of some of the feat that he had been able to accomplish politically, which would not have been something that you might have foreseen.
Well, let me ask you a quick question. Let me ask you a quick question there, because I mean, before we get into all of these other scandals, I mean, you know that everybody knew everything that's come out before even that primary happened. So the question is, you know, why are these things timed in the way that they are? And let me give you a reason why I bring it up. My mother ran for Congress in Arizona back in the early 90s and won the Democratic primary hands down with a against the establishment candidate in a very wild and big campaign. And then the Democratic Party played a role in sabotaging her campaign because she did not align with the establishment. So, and that was back then when people didn't think that happened. So I don't get it still why these things weren't even addressed beforehand, because they were with her.
Well, to my knowledge, until Monday, there had been no claim made in the public arena that he had actually committed rape, or there was no outright rape allegation, right? This woman who was thrust into this big PR offensive, like it was choreographed, literally. She had been in the public domain a month before in the New York Times article on June 4th that was much vaguer in terms of what was even being alleged. It was hard to define, if you go back and read that article, if anything was being alleged at all in terms of some kind of concrete misconduct, right? It was instead kind of like imputations to Platner about events or relationship dynamics from 10 or 15 years in the past, in some cases, where
you're talking about, just so
women,
people understand, you're talking about Jenny Rasicot, if that's how to pronounce her name, the woman we saw in the opening video who said she threw up 3 times before she did the CNN interview. Who wouldn't throw up 3 times before going on CNN? But anyway,
I might throw up out of just like disgust rather than nervousness. But yeah, I think it's pronounced Rasco. Actually, I think it's like a French maybe origin surname. I'm not 100% sure.
But then that's part of the orchestration, is what you're saying with the New York Times, the beginning of an orchestration.
I'm kind of making a more narrow point, right?
Okay.
In that the reason why this claim emerged on Monday afternoon is that there was a concerted and openly disclosed PR campaign undertaken by a particular person, Cheyenne Hunt, who is named in the Politico article where the story was quote unquote broken because she fed them the story, meaning fed them the victim or the alleged victim who was going to debut this newly intensified version of her supposed victimization. And then also that was kind of coordinated with the interview that she did on CNN with Jake Tapper. So again, this isn't hidden. It's not even something we have to speculate. It's in the article as to what the origin of this allegation was. So over the past month, since this woman first leveled some kind of public allegations against Platner, she had then begun to work with or be in the sort of milieu of, or like had been in collaboration with this entity of this woman, Cheyenne Hunt, and this new organization that she had founded in May, which she kind of pompously calls Reckoning Action, that she founded in with the involvement to one degree or another with Democratic Party politicians. So the Democratic Women's Caucus, members of it, like Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Debbie Dingell, Rashida Tlaib, and some others, they were on hand in Washington, D.C. at some kind of press event when she announced the formation of this new organization, which she founded because of her great triumph that she was declaring for herself, having been behind the orchestration of the ouster of Eric Swalwell in April. Now, I've been asking, okay, if this woman's involvement in defenestrating Eric Swalwell is supposed to have endowed her with this like historic importance such that she felt it was her prerogative to found a new group, number one, who would like then pick additional targets, and they end up picking Platner, right? So number one, who's funding the group? Nobody knows. Number two, who does the group coordinate with? Like, does it coordinate with any of these members of Congress? What is the function of this group other than just like a PR portal for Cheyenne Hunt, who thinks is described as some like groundbreaking, 29-year-old influencer or something?
It's like a business thing, basically.
And number three, well, I don't know. I mean, it would be nice to know a little bit more about their financials. Number three, in the 3 months or so since the Eric Swalwell ordeal happened, has the evidence that was promised would emerge to substantiate allegations of assault and or rape against Swalwell, has it emerged? Now, that story has been mostly memory hold, right? Because, it happened in April, so it might as well like been before the crucifixion of Christ. But no, in fact, the evidence that was promised would be marshaled to show Swalwell's guilt has not emerged. There's been virtually no follow-up on any of those allegations, right? But they did
Well,
that.
that's a fair point, Michael. But correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't Eric Swalwell, or wasn't he, basically liked by the powers that be in the Democratic Party? Weren't his positions in alignment with them, whereas Platner's maybe weren't? Is that a...
Well, I mean, probably to some degree, yes, because, Swalwell was kind of a protege of Nancy Pelosi. He was sort of like, in good standing with the Democratic leadership in the House. He was the leading candidate in terms of the polls, not by a huge margin, but still leading for the Democratic gubernatorial primary in California. That's sort of what prompted this effort to nuke him. But I don't think it's not. I don't think it's right to say that in order to predict whether somebody might be faced with this kind of onslaught, they would have to be antagonistic toward any particular faction in the Democratic Party. Because what the evidence has shown, what the record now, I think, indisputably demonstrates for us, is that there really is no ideological demarcation within the spectrum of the Democratic Party as to what heterosexual male candidate or figure could be in for this kind of deluge of accusations, and then the instantaneous repudiation and almost like at warp speed they're forced to capitulate and resign or withdraw.
Michael, that makes sense. If you're saying if a controversy arises, if accusations surface, you're saying they'll pay attention to the accusations regardless of whether or not the politicians' positions are in alignment with the powers that be. But it's something else if the powers that be are the ones that were in cahoots and set it up to begin with. I think it was your Substack post, you detailed the precise timing, as soon as the controversy broke, a few minutes later, this politician was ready to condemn him. It looked, and then the media was too. The interview was all set. It looked like it was very coordinated with the powers that be.
In terms of the politicians and these Democratic Party entities rushing out to denounce Platner and demand his withdrawal, I don't know that was coordinated in any kind of top-down effort, right? It's not that difficult to quote, or have things appear organically coordinated when you're using social media or internet statements on websites if they happen at the same time. Because what happens? I mean, people are in group chats, or people hear the breaking news, and they, especially with an issue that is so salient for the Democratic Party coalition, has anything to do with rape or sexual assault. Yeah, especially nationally ambitious Democratic.
So you see it as opportunism?
I see it as a calculation that it's in the political self-interest of the people who issued those rapid fire denunciations, that they have to make sure that they're out front as quickly as possible, showing that, to put themselves on record calling for the termination with Platner's campaign. Because the way that I put it in the Substack was that so you have Ruben Gallego, who's a senator from Arizona, and then Ro Khanna, congressman. Both are in a phase now where they're kind of gearing up to potentially run for president. They haven't made a firm decision probably, but they're in a pre-campaign phase where they're kind of getting their ducks in a row and thinking what the message will be and who the endorsements will be, what maybe quadrant of the party they might appeal to in a primary race, etc. And so they're kind of thus in an implicit race against one another to show who could be most demonstrative of their sensitivity toward issues like this, which are incredibly potent within the Democratic Party coalition in particular, and can become an issue down the line if an opponent of yours says, hey, you were not at all prompt enough in recognizing the gravity of these allegations and calling on Platner to resign. You didn't show enough leadership, like it can become a political point of contention, right? So what do? They rush out as quickly as possible to get their statements out. I don't think it was like some decree came down from Chuck Schumer or Barack Obama or something, right? I think it's a little bit more organic than that. That really does stem from the unique salience, unlike virtually any other issue, that allegations of rape holds for the party coalition for the Democrats, such that like it's the only thing really, as I sort of argue in the Substack, that can stimulate the party kind of coalitional infrastructure into this ruthless and decisive action. Because otherwise you can hardly get the Democrats to like, screw in a light bulb in any particularly expeditious period of time.
That's true. That's true. Actually, Michael, I was thinking about this because of one of the comments that I saw on X, right? They were, and this is going back to an article about Platner, saying, okay, it's a Totenkopf tattoo. He was a PMC in Iraq. He was a shit poster on Reddit, all of these things that basically made him a right-wing guy and this. So then some people are saying, well, why didn't he come out like Donald Trump and basically just blow past all of this? And I think that potentially this, like you say, the last straw that you can rally people around is rape, is because, he could have been one of these people that mobilized various independent layers in the population who say, well, Trump's populism makes sense, but I also agree with the Democrats on this kind of thing. Because if you listen to him, he's not really that wild and crazy. But if you put all those things in an article and line that litany up, then you're like, oh my God, if you're a Democrat, right? This is a Trump guy. Why do we want him?
Yeah, I mean, what made him sort of a distinctive political figure in the American political scene, let's say, is that he did something. He's an unusual archetype in that he is probably more right-coded in terms of his cultural sensibilities,
right?
From, for example, military service, which is heavily masculine coded, more so than right necessarily, but masculine coded in terms of his cultural background and maybe proclivities. He's a fisherman of some sort, or an oyster farmer, which is heavily male coded. The military service, obviously, or just kind of like the kind of ruggedness and his manner.
He's not DSA. Let's put it that way.
Well, but the thing is, not in terms of what he projects culturally, but then what makes him unique is that even though he's projecting this more kind of quintessentially right-coded orientation, he still has the quote-unquote DSA-style policy views in the main, where he could run as a DSA candidate someplace, right? But it's just that he uniquely kind of fuses these things, these sensibilities together in a way that doesn't typically get fused. And that manifested a bit, I guess, in terms of his policy views. Like he had a more of a permissive attitude in terms of his stated policy preferences toward gun ownership, Second Amendment, that might be typical for a average Democrat. So that's one, way that it showed itself in terms of the policy platform. But by and large, I mean, he kind of was he was like a Bernie Sanders, sort of a mini Bernie, more or less. I think that kind of spoke to, in part anyway, how it is that he galvanized the political stature that he did, because he had this unique dual image of, number one, being left-wing and kind of even like rancorously left-wing in the policy prescriptions he was promoting, while also coupling that with the more kind of typically right-wing coded or masculine coded cultural identifiers that the Democrats in particular have recognized that they needed to do the work to like make themselves more in affinity with. Like, remember after the 2024 election, like there was this internal party discussion that, obviously played out in the media as well. What can Democrats do to bring back young white men, right? Or young men in general? Like, should we go on the podcasts, or what do we need to do? because it was understood, and this was true, it was borne out in the data that Trump did particularly well amongst young men writ large in his 2024 campaign, and Democrats were kind of like shedding support in that demographic, and Graham Platner maybe could be an answer to that question, at least in the minds of like how people are perceiving it, right? So I did want to make a quick. I wanted to make I wanted to make a quick point, just generally and contextually, because you asked me, how it felt to be in a position where people are obviously flinging, lots of stones and arrows at me for getting involved with this story.
Don't die on the Epstein Hill.
Yeah, I mean, but I think there's a reason. I think it's actually very necessary to do. And it's necessary for somebody to do if they are sort of uniquely immunized from being cowed by like mobs or giving into pressure from like the social media, firing squads. Because there's actually some really significant underlying principles at stake. It's not just due process or whatever. It's just that if nobody challenges any of this stuff, whomever it really affects, whether it's Eric Swalwell, who's on a different sort of part of the Democratic Party coalition, or even Andrew Cuomo. Like Andrew Cuomo and Graham Platner don't have a lot of common ideologically in terms of where they would be situated within the Democratic Party coalition, right? But you still had these machinations that were successfully employed against them as a stand-in from actually challenging them politically or electorally. Right. And so I think just validating these tactics and everybody being just so paralyzed from engaging rationally in like an evidence-based examination of what's being alleged and like, is it credible and whatever, it's pernicious for the political culture, for sure, but also society writ large in ways that I think are not fully understood or appreciated. And I would have similar logic in terms of why I got so immersed in the Epstein thing as well.
Okay, so let me address that right there, because I think that you're starting to get at the real core of this thing, which is, one, you have this kind of stuff that we've seen, and I think also with Epstein, but it's slightly different on that, tends to drive regular people who are interested in bread and butter, economy, my job, my health care, my retirement, all of these very mundane, but, it's a question of if I'm on the street or not kind of questions. It drives them away. They're like, well, I never get to hear what the guy actually is for, or what are any of these people actually going to do to change the course of so it's cynicism. People just become cynical and they're like, I'm out of here. I'm not even going to vote. So that means that you have fewer and fewer people with more and more money making the decisions. So that's one thing. On Epstein, it's the same thing in a slightly different way. And I want to get your view on this, which is that the real scandal is not so much everything we've heard, but actually the money that is, moving to shape policy and keep people out of it in this country. In other words, we have sort of a token democracy going on here, where people think voting is it, and everybody to vote for is kind of a slime ball on some level.
I'm not sure I would
no leadership.
I'm not sure I would totally agree with that interpretation of Epstein, or like the function of the Epstein saga in terms of how people conceptualize their political preferences or conceive of what their interests are. Because, for one thing, no one would ever know the name Jeffrey Epstein except for the sexual or even pedophilic connotations that it carried, which is how it became such a thing to begin with. It wasn't just because the guy happened to be wealthy, right? I mean, because he would be a dime a dozen in terms of that, or that he used his wealth to exert political influence.
More important. Yeah, so I'm saying those things are
also, it's of course political insofar as we're talking about it, but there's also the issue itself, which is sexual abuse or alleged sexual abuse, especially if it involves minors or younger women. Because, you look at the Kavanaugh thing, which I guess he wasn't a politician, but that was political. But then you have people like Woody Allen and Roman Polanski And people are just irrational about this topic, whether or not.
Well, it's salacious, though. That's the thing. People just get totally dragged into the salacious thing, and they forget about the things that are actually in their best interest.
Here's the way I would put it in terms of the effect on, let's say, quote unquote, ordinary people, and why that should be one of the reasons to resolve, to interrogate these kinds of issues critically rather than just giving in to the raving mobs. On Epstein, right, there's this kind of common perception that, if you are at all skeptical about anything to do with Epstein, you're just kind of like running cover for elites, right? Because the people who had to resign from things or apologize or whatever for having an association with Epstein, they tended to be people who were in high positions of high society to one degree or another, whether in finance or academia or the political world, et cetera. And that is true. I mean, that was one of the repercussions of the Epstein story in the past year or so. But the reverberations go well beyond that. I've been, doing FOIA requests to school districts around the country where there was this mass mania in February and March, where schools across the United States canceled their school picture day because of rumors that had been flooding TikTok and things that one of the big school photography companies had been exposed as in the Epstein files, and therefore parents were convinced that their child's school photographs were being transmitted into a giant pedophile database. Okay, so it caused all this tumult at these schools where they were like canceling contracts and like for 2026, like there's no school pictures for some kids and stuff. So it's just crazy, and like that crazy making stuff is affecting ordinary people. And also when you inculcate quote unquote norms that tend to erode civil liberties, that does affect average people who are not wealthy.
Well, that's a perfect example of what I mean. It's not
resources.
just
if the state comes after them, then would people like an Epstein or others in his circles who can like hire really good defense attorneys, like Joe Schmo can't do that.
Well, that's a perfect example of what I mean. It has nothing to do with politics. It's just this sexual element. What do you think is, I have a couple of theories, but let me ask you first before I pontificate.
And also, one more thing with Platner, right, in terms of ordinary people being affected. Platner on June 9th just won the highest vote total of any Democratic Senate candidate in the history of the state of Maine. So, yeah, there were a lot of, quote, ordinary people who voted for Platner, liked him on some level, or liked him enough to vote for him in any way. And now what's happened is this like insider putsch where as a result of him withdrawing, which he hasn't formally done, by the way, he says he's going to do it on Monday, like at the literal deadline. So who knows? Right. But now these party chieftains can gather in some unspecified conclave type process to install their own preferred nominee. So
but I think that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, if you were asked to counsel Platner, I'm not saying you would be, but let's just pretend you were asked. What would you counsel him to do? Would you have counseled him to not announce that he's dropping out previously? And now that he's announced it, would you counsel him to pull some stunt or however you want to put it and not necessarily give the official withdrawal notification on Monday?
Well, longer term, it's different. It's difficult or impossible to know what the political ramifications would be in terms of his chances to win the Senate race in November against Susan Collins. Like it's conceivable that there's some segment of the electorate he would otherwise need to court, let's say, older liberal women who might feel as though they can not vote for him as a result of the allegations, however credible they may or may not be. So it could be the case that he has been damaged enough that his chances of winning that race have been severely lowered. But I don't think they're at zero. I don't think they're even at like 20 or 30. I think it's a Democratic wave year in all likelihood, and probably likely to be a rather substantial Democratic wave where even a, quote, flawed candidate might be buoyed by the national political environment to win in a particular race. So this idea that it's a lost cause completely, I think, is stupid.
Well, there's one thing he knows something that the rest of us don't know, which is he knows to what extent these accusations are true, and we don't.
And he's
really
adamant
know.
that they are false, and in fact that they are fabricated. So
well, I know, but he's saying that, and maybe they are false. But
yeah.
What I'm saying is he knows whether or not they're false, and we don't know.
Right.
Now, let me ask what you think, because I don't want to overinterpret one word that you have in your headline, because it's clear that you don't think, and nobody should doubt that there's not any evidence or hardly any evidence. But from this word manufacture a sex crime, it looks like you go beyond that and you think he's innocent. Am I interpreting that headline correctly?
Well, I'm saying that the allegations have been manufactured in that, again, as I sketched out before, they were literally seeded to media outlets by this woman and her new, shady entity that is, triumphant, having ousted Swalwell, and then they it was openly declared that Platner was next for her, because she had this woman, Cheyenne Hunt, had initially endorsed Platner in October when she was running some other dopey, progressive NGO thing. And then she rescinded her endorsement after the New York Times article on June 4th. And she said, okay, next in the crosshairs is Graham Platner. So it's not a secret here. Okay. And why do I say manufacture? Well, the Politico article was kind of structured in such a way that it gave the impression to a casual viewer, or maybe somebody who just glanced at the headline or sees the reaction to it, that they found all this dispositive corroboration for the claim, right? So it was a rock solid claim. That's just false. Okay. There is no corroboration whatsoever for the claim. In fact, there's anti-corroboration, or there's grounds for doubting that corroboration could even exist, because they're citing her correspondences with her therapist, who they don't name, and suggesting that it's corroborative that in one of an email sometime in the past month, she wrote this like shorthand reference in like an email body SA/rape to the therapist. That's not contemporaneous corroboration. This supposedly took place in 2021, meaning the alleged rape. Right. And then the therapist refuses to speak to the reporter, even though presumably this woman would have authorized the therapist to speak to the reporter to provide any corroboration that the therapist could provide, right? So that's grounds for doubt, and yet it was the article was framed in such a way as to make it seem like the allegation was bulletproof. How about one of the two co-authors on the article, Alex Wren of Politico, somehow not having a single second thought about this woman claiming that after the alleged rape, like in an undetermined time after, I think she suggested maybe even weeks afterwards, she sent messages over Instagram DM to Platner in which she claims that she described his conduct as non-consensual in some form. And then mysterious. So what would any journalist do if they're told that these messages exist? Ask her to provide them. Mysteriously, they vanished without explanation. So like that doesn't give you like at all pause. So the way that this was framed kind of conveyed just an entirely different impression than what the actual strength of the evidence should have conveyed. And number two, it was, again, coordinated with this CNN interview where, she's talking about how she believed herself to be in a, quote, situationship with Platner. I mean, really, if a woman is raped by someone, would she like casually describe herself as being in a, quote, situationship with them? I mean, that alone doesn't prove anything. It's just like one data point. She says that when he shows up, she allows him to sleep in her bed for the night after the purported rape. She, in turn, herself sleeps in bed with her purported rapist. And the following morning, she's confused because he doesn't have a conversation with her. He just gets up and leaves. Okay, so I don't know. And in the Facebook messages that I put in the Politico article, she says, "Oh, he's a great guy. He's decently intelligent. He's not all bad. And yet I had this issue with him.
Charming and funny.
Yeah.
No bacon and eggs.
A charming and funny rapist, like a charming and funny guy.
As rapists go, he's top of the line.
So that's why I say manufactured, because it was like manufactured by an organ run by this woman who has unknown connections that we don't know in full detail with elements of the Democratic Party, who then expressly planted the story on a particular day.
Right. Well, I didn't mean to
happened
suggest
be,
you
like 5 days before the statutory deadline in Maine for the nominee to be replaced on the ballot.
I didn't mean to suggest you shouldn't have put it that way. I just want to know whether or not you believe he's innocent. So obviously, you believe there's a good chance
in the American system. Okay,
presumed
you don't
innocent.
you don't prove anybody's innocence. Their guilt
Right.
must be proven.
Right.
Okay, so here's what I would say. I'm not going to declare anybody innocent of something. I'm going to say that the evidence presented in no way could support the utter certainty that we saw agreed upon as like the unshakable consensus within a matter of minutes on Monday when this stuff broke. To me, there is no way that could be rationally justified by what's been presented thus far. So can I outright declare him innocent? No, that's not really how it works. Has there any even modicum of a burden of proof been meant to create even like a tentative confidence that he committed rape? No, I would say.
So how do you think how do you think he should use his leverage at this point?
Well, you asked like what I would advise him to do.
Does he have leverage at this point?
Well, yeah, he has leverage because if he doesn't withdraw, then they're in trouble, and he wants to participate in choosing who runs and so forth. He wants to have input in that.
I mean, you asked like what advice I would give. I would say, look, anybody who tries to claim in July of 2026 that in November of 2026 you would have a 0% chance in a Democratic wave year of defeating Susan Collins, they're talking out of their you know what. Okay, I would say even if the chances have gone down to some extent, they can't be lower than like 30%. So if he has a 30% chance of being the junior Democratic senator from Maine, that's a gamble that most people would probably take, because especially if the alternative is to capitulate, withdraw, and implicitly brand yourself now as somebody who is in fact a rapist, no matter what transpires factually or evidentially in the months and years that follow, 99% of people who have heard about this controversy will never hear about it. What they will have heard is you resigned after allegations that you committed rape. Okay. And number two, look, I mean, I think we can't really forecast with any certainty. I hate when pundits kind of like can pretend as though they have certainty as to what a future electoral outcome would be. But here's one thing I can be certain of. It can't possibly be rational to simply give in to a sputtering mob circus within the span of like 24 hours, because mobs don't tend to exhibit like flawless rationality for the most part. It's like a consensus that just congeals out of nowhere based on some moralistic panic that breaks out. And once people like maybe have 2 seconds to think about things, then
but they have this deadline to have his name removed from the ballot, which is Monday. That's kind of the wrinkle in it.
And there's also
talk about capitulation. This guy Al Franken capitulated over very very close to nothing. And I think you mentioned that in one of your articles, Michael.
Yeah, well, I mean, what happened with Franken, I don't know if you recall, is that basically the Democratic leadership of the Senate, at the urging or demand of Kirsten Gillibrand, called on Franken to resign. Or I might not have that 100% right, but there was instant capitulation that was instigated by Kirsten Gillibrand, and then it just like became believed, including by pro-democratic pundits. Like I remember Michelle Goldberg at the New York Times was saying that, like, look, we love Al Franken, he's doing a great job. Maybe he didn't even really do anything wrong, but for the sake of the party, for the sake of our moral standing in this age of Me Too, and to show we're better than the Republicans, nevertheless, he must go. And then Michelle Goldberg later on would say she regrets doing that. Meaning she regrets calling for Franken's ouster. And like from her perch at the New York Times, she does have an impact in whether that happens, because the Democrats are highly responsive to elite media, unlike Republicans.
I think Franken was a pussy for giving in because, see, unlike Platner has to worry about, the funding being withdrawn for campaigning and all the, machinery that goes along with it, whereas Franken was already in office. He could have just told them to fuck off.
Yeah, I think that's right. And they have this whole theory, we're going to replace him with a woman, so that's going to satisfy anybody in terms of our sensitivity to Me Too. I mean, it was so silly. But Platner's in a different position because you asked, why wouldn't Trump do something like this? Well, I mean, Trump would have been in charge. Trump is a presidential candidate, right? Or is a president, is effectively in charge of his own financial operation, meaning fundraising, donors, expenditures, etc., because it's a presidential campaign. He's basically the CEO of the campaign, or
Platner's not.
Right. So, Platner alone can't control what the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee chooses, whether they choose to disperse his share of the national financing pool to his candidacy. Now, I think even that said, or one of the other, another part of his reasoning that he laid out in that video yesterday was that they're going to deprive him of access to the voter file. So the DNC, the central party organs, both parties have this centralized voter file that they give access to under certain conditions to candidates running in the name of a Democrat or Republican. And he's saying that they're going to cut his campaign off from that voter file, so they can't do just the basics of campaigning with canvassing and so forth, phone banking. Now, that may be true. But okay, nothing is set in stone on July, 8th when he dropped out, or he said he intended to withdraw. Is it really that difficult to fathom that by late September, when the midterm, people's minds are more concentrated on the midterms and, we're going down to the wire in terms of who's going to control the Senate for the second half of Trump's term, the Democrats are going to say, look, I mean, yeah, maybe the guy has some issues, but we got to beat Susan Collins. So give him the voter file, give him the funding that you said you were going to cut off. That's not inconceivable to me at all. In fact, it might even be likely. So I would say don't be hostage to the moment so much.
Well, again, that depends. I think a lot on,
also,
I said before.
Way, you got the most votes of any primary candidate in the history of Maine. It's doesn't that count for something?
And probably those people all are not watching all of these scandals. So actually somebody in the audience that's watching made an interesting point, because you were talking about Trump controlling things for his campaign versus Platner. He said, why then must Trump pay $5.3 million to this Carol woman?
Because he lost the case.
That's got nothing to do with Trump's campaign expenditures. That's a civil judgment that came about through litigation brought by.
Here's a better question from the same guy. This is Somerville John watching us on Rumble. And he calls you Mr. Tracey, so he's showing you respect here, Michael. Do the people of Maine understand that Platner is 100% disabled, or has that been hidden from them? Is he 100% disabled?
I think he receives veterans benefits on the ground that he can assert 100% disability. But to say that a veteran is disabled where they can qualify for certain veterans benefits doesn't mean that they're literally disabled in the sense of being bedbound or that they can't function, right?
It's you can have asthma. You can have asthma.
Yeah.
Well, he had PTSD, I think, is his issue. In fact, I think that was one of his excuses for why he, behaved as he did in the past.
Yeah, I think his explanations for his behavior were not always the most convincing. The infamous quote unquote Nazi tattoo. The explanations didn't ring true for some people because I don't know. I tend to think, and I wrote about this, about a month ago. I tend to think if you gave him truth serum, right, and asked why did you get that tattoo when you were on leave with the Marines in Croatia in 2005. He probably could have had some awareness that the tattoo was aesthetically evocative of what kind of aesthetics might have been used in Nazi Germany, right? Because
considering that there are a lot of Nazis historically in Croatia, by the way.
Yeah. So he could have had some notion that there was some maybe provenance to this tattoo that had something to do with I don't know, the German Nazi Party, whatever. But that's totally different from him having gotten the tattoo because he intended to signify some kind of political affinity with the National Socialism or Hitler or something, right? Which he almost certainly did not, which would be the significant thing if he had done so. But like, that's not an explanation that you can like crisply give when you're under the national spotlight in like a highly contested and nationally consequential Senate race. So instead, he comes up with the rationalization that he just didn't know, and which probably might not be 100% true, even though it might be the only thing he can like realistically say at that moment. And so like invoking PTSD, right? And like in terms of like why he'll say he had said he acknowledged he had been a bad boyfriend in the past, right? Or maybe he hadn't treated some of the women he was involved with particularly well, and he'll chalk that up to the PTSD. I mean, I do think that routine gets a little trite too. I mean, it's like a little bit too much of a excuse making. Like not everybody who had undergone some kind of let's say traumatic event and can get a PTSD diagnosis is therefore going to like do something that could be like violative of a woman, right? So it's almost like trying to
well, it's got to say something,
deflect from his agency or something in a way that I don't really. Yeah, but the thing is, like, he was just almost like between a rock and a hard place with this stuff, because
yeah,
I mean,
I would like him to say, so what? Because a lot of this stuff, even though it's very bad behavior in many cases, it doesn't really have a direct relationship to how they're going to be a public servant. Like, remember Ted Kennedy? Many people, I don't know what happened for sure at Chappaquiddick, but the fact is many people think he left a woman to drown. Well, that's a terrible thing. Let's assume he did that. But the voters in Massachusetts kept voting for him for many years. And it's like, well, how are you going to argue that what happened at Chappaquiddick is even relevant when you see what he's doing as a senator? He takes this position or that position. He votes this way. He votes that way. This bad behavior isn't even relevant.
I don't know. I mean, what happened with Chappaquiddick, if memory serves, is that Ted Kennedy was driving in a car late at night with a young woman who was, I don't remember if he was married technically at the time, but like with a young woman who was basically like his date or like had accompanied him somewhere. And he drives over a bridge. His car sinks into the water. He's able to escape, and the woman dies. And then he leaves the scene.
Right.
Or he doesn't call for help until long past the time where the woman could have even been potentially saved. Right. And then I do think he was charged with a crime. I think he actually pleaded guilty to some criminal offense, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go check. So that does speak to something about his just judgment, or that, I mean, that you could see voters reasonably taking into account when they're assessing somebody to vote for. But with Platner, there's nothing even in the same universe. I mean, you're asking what advice I would give. I would say, how about just saying this is none of your business. I mean, they're talking about just like the New York Times story that set this whole thing into motion, right? On June 4th. Those allegations, in the main, are basically these women whom he had dated in what they call on and off relationships, right? So I don't know, casual dating, or how you characterize it exactly, being asked by the New York Times to kind of emotionally frame things that occurred years in the past and then characterize his behavior. So we get words like toxic, or this Republican operative woman who was quoted and is now like still being interviewed by CNN and stuff, Lindsay Fiffield. She says he was contemptuous of women's emotions. Like, what does that mean? They're talking about consenting adult relationships that maybe did not end as these women would have wanted, or that they look back on with some degree of regret, or that were even maybe negatively experienced to some extent by them at the time, and then framing it as something that should bear like directly upon this political candidate that in no way ought to do so in any rational universe. You know what people should instead want, at least I would argue, in a rational universe, is that there has to be some like cone of privacy for people. Yes, even including those who choose to maybe seek elected office, where, within reason, right? Even if you do have some kind of like tumult let's say in a past relationship, but it's like nonetheless between consenting adults. Like that's not something that necessarily has to be litigated by the entire nation. Like you've made somebody feel bad, or somebody didn't like something and they've been thinking, like that's something that like I think we have to allow consenting adults to like.
In other words, bad behavior isn't necessarily a public matter.
Well, we don't even. How bad was his behavior? I don't know. I mean, like he hasn't got.
I don't know either.
Opportunity to go
look,
point
Michael,
by point.
Michael,
and maybe these women, maybe this woman Lindsay seems like a psycho. So maybe she was in the wrong.
Look, let's go.
Oh yeah, we didn't even talk about her. She's the second accuser who says that he sneakily took off his condom while having sex repeatedly. Right? Repeatedly? Am I right?
Yeah, she was also quoted in the New York Times story, right?
I mean,
so,
if you notice, like pedestrian, salacious stuff that has nothing to do with actually governing a country. That's the thing to me, because it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Michael. After 2024, Democrats said, well, you know, what are we going to do to start winning elections? Are we going to have some retrospective and think about how we don't do anything that actually will reach out to the population? It wasn't, by the way, just young men. It was everything. I mean, it was the whole country policy, everything. And it seems like, they were involved just as much as CNN, the establishment, in whatever came out with Platner to scuttle his campaign, because they still haven't decided that they're going to provide any real leadership in a policy way for the American people, as an alternative to Donald Trump. And that's not saying anything about Trump. I think that's really what's going on here. And it's just like a lot of noise over the fact that these guys still don't have a clue as to how to govern the country.
Yeah, I do think there are circumstances in which a candidate's private life and even romantic history, quote unquote, could be considered relevant in terms of how voters might assess them as being fit or not for public service or elected office. Like, for example, if somebody actually is just a chronic pathological abuser of women, right? And has a trail of, like, let's say, credible accusations against him. If they get elected to office, like, that could potentially mean that they have to run a staff, they have to meet people, they're like representing the United States abroad potentially. Like, what if they do something on some kind of foreign trip? There's grounds why somebody might take into account like evidence of their wrongful personal behavior in assessing whether this is somebody that you want to put in a position of public trust. And like, look, let's take Bill Clinton. I mean, when he was running in 1992, there were rumors, like he eventually had to come out and address, I think it was Jennifer Flowers or something, who had made claims against him. He went on 60 Minutes with Hillary. It was like this Tammy Wynette moment, stand by your man, whatever. And sure enough, I mean, it did come to pass that Bill Clinton had an affair with an intern in the Oval Office, more or less. And even if it was consensual, it still created a huge distraction. It's still like White House resources poured into managing the fallout from this stupid thing, rather than like doing something that could advance the public interest in any way. Or look at Donald Trump. I mean, people I think were pretty cognizant of Donald Trump's proclivities when he was running in 2016, which is why when the Access Hollywood thing comes out, all the pundits assume that must have would doom his candidacy. Has no impact, right? But he gets into office, and what does he do? He brings the CEO of the National Enquirer to the White House, so he can strategize with him, David Pecker, as to how best to handle a story having to do with somebody that Trump seemingly admitted that he did have an affair with, who was a Playboy playmate, and didn't even like really allege any wrongdoing on his part, but it was like out there, and it was something that like he had to devote. Like, a president only has finite mental energy, political resources. There's only so much time in a day, right? So if he's dealing with, okay, how are we going to handle the Playboy playmate who, like, the National Enquirer is trying to contain the story around? Like, that's something that a voter could take into consideration in terms of whether they want to vote for somebody. So, but in terms of, and even like you could make a less severe judgment about Platner, which is that, I don't know. I mean, he did see. How many people how many women can somebody date? I mean, I don't know, like how many. It seems like everybody and their mother has dated Platner. He was on like a million apps. It's just like, I don't know. I mean, there's maybe a little bit.
Yeah, I
too
don't
much.
have the energy. I don't have the.
There might be a little. You could reasonably infer that maybe his personal life is a little bit too chaotic to have confidence would be stable enough where like it wouldn't become a distraction if he became a senator. Like that's reasonable, but it's not reasonable to say, oh, he's a rapist. Like that is not reasonable. Okay, so there are gradations here in terms of what judgment.
And there's also a separation
made.
to be made between bad behavior in one's personal life and in a work environment. Trump has a lot of allegations against him, but it was all in the personal domain. There's never been any allegations in his businesses that he was abusing his employees. And there's been no allegations of him, of any kind of sexual harassment no sexual harassment in the White House or anything like that.
Not quite, because right? I mean, he was a beauty pageant proprietor, right? So he ran Miss Teen USA, and there was one accusation that got a lot of attention at the time in 2016 was that there was an occasion where he just let himself into the changing room for the beauty pageant contestants while they were like naked or half naked, and they're like, "Oh, look, Mr. Trump! Oh, we're covering." So like that was something.
Okay,
that
so you're right. That was a work situation.
Yeah. And
there was also
somebody from The Apprentice.
What else?
No, there were also allegations going back that he wouldn't pay his workers on time, or
but we're talking about the sexual harassment stuff.
Oh yeah, but you said business too.
Yeah, I mean, I
labor settlements.
Speaking of that, like I remember there was a cabinet maker or something in Atlantic City who gave furnishings for Trump's casino, whom he was alleged to have never paid. Yeah, I always thought that kind of stuff should be more focused on. He basically just screwed over
$1 million in labor settlements that he had to pay out.
Yeah, but there were also accusations. I mean, I'm not saying these accusations are necessarily credible. I actually think that this one wasn't. It was some contestant on The Apprentice alleged that something happened over the course of the TV show, right? So that one I actually don't think is credible, but like there was an allegation of something to do with Trump that took place in what you might call a work environment. But again, I mean, so again, I'm not saying I'm not saying anybody has to therefore not vote for Trump on account of those accusations. I'm just saying, people can make considered judgments about things. But
I just mean, no, that's fine. So maybe he's not, maybe his record isn't totally pristine in the work arena, but I think that's a consideration to be made. Does whatever bad behavior is being alleged, does that really have relevance to being a public servant? Like the Kavanaugh thing, that woman who came at the 11th hour, what's her name? Christine Blasey Ford. Something that allegedly happened when Kavanaugh was a teenager is not really the thing to go on when you have a guy who's been a judge for like 25, 30 years, and you have all the evidence, whether good or bad, of how he treated his workers and how he conducted himself as a judge. That's what to go by, not some personal thing that happened a long time ago.
Yeah, I agree. But in terms of like a presidential candidate, right, or a candidate for some federal or even state office, any office, voters are entitled to make whatever judgment they want, for better or worse. Like they're not required to say, oh, it's especially bad, or it's only really of relevance to me in terms of my voting decision if it took place in some kind of employment setting. Like they can make whatever judgment they want. That's the freedom of America, right? So like if stuff is going to be out there, I'm just it's still
bread and circuses. Either way that you put it, it's still bread and circuses.
I know, but you got to. I mean, if you think that voters making decisions about the character of a candidate, right, like based on their sexual history or whether they were a good or bad boyfriend or something, like that's something you got to take up with the voters if they're allowing that to inform their decision, right?
I agree. But that's also CNN and these other media companies who supposedly are informing the population. They're insisting they're insisting you have to think only about that.
But that's why I say it was manufactured, right? Because they manufacture basically on false pretenses a thing about you could imagine an alternate timeline here where there's a rational way to evaluate and form judgments about Platner's personal proclivities. That didn't then result in this insane escalation that is not grounded in any like credible evidence that it must be rape. Like that's another thing that I think also affects ordinary people, or is another reason why there needs to be a rational intervention to correctly kind of interrogate this stuff when it explodes in the way that it did this week. Yeah. Which is that, like, look at the pattern here. So June 4th, we have a New York Times story that got the whole thing in motion where, like, it's incredibly vague what he's even alleged to have done wrong. They're like kind of just characterizing stuff as like toxic or unsettling or whatever. And all of a sudden, within a matter of months, like some of these like behind the scenes operators get together and we get escalation, escalation, where now it becomes rape. So like, I don't know. I mean, I just think that, right. There are people who don't have resources.
Yeah. Well, look at the mission of this organization, of that woman that started Reckoning Action. They're confronting misogyny. Rape, at least, is a specific action that we can all say is repulsive, wrong, illegal, and so forth. But misogyny is so vague and broad.
It's culture war.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite Me Too. People have asked me about that, so I've been thinking about it. I think the Me Too era, as such, actually has closed. In that we're not in the same, we're not in the throes of the same kind of dynamics as would have been the case in like November 2017 or even into 2018. When what you may call peak Me Too with Harvey Weinstein, and then you get like a cascade of other men in media or various fields who are accused of things, and then like they're all resigning or what have you. I do think that there is like a pretty widespread awareness across the spectrum to a large extent that of some of the pitfalls or the excesses of Me Too, things that are reconsidered or like regret for not being a little bit more circumspect before just taking things to be true, or like how the media can shape perceptions and whatnot. So I don't think it's quite right to say that we're in Me Too still, or like it's another phase of Me Too. It's like something else. It's something distinct to whatever we're in the middle of right now in 2026. One of my hypotheses is that I kind of like earlier today on X, kind of like half jokingly said, instead of the Me Too era, you could say that in 2026, we're in something that you might call like the zombie Epstein era. Because like we have just gone through a year, right, where we've been suffused with all these kind of like wild and grandiose claims and theories and speculations around some kind of like all pervasive child sex trafficking, pedophilia scandal crisis that is supposed to like cause this giant reckoning and like has all these spillover effects. And, it's part of the reason why I would offer that the Democratic figures who came out so urgently to call on Platner to withdraw as quickly as humanly possible. Part of it is because they've been like, trying to leverage the Epstein story against Trump and the Republicans for the past year, whether it's called railing against the Epstein class. So like guys like John Ossoff, who might run for president, or Ro Khanna, clearly running, they have to, or Ruben Gallego, they have to insulate themselves from potential exposure to hypocrisy charges, even if it's not like quite the same issue. Like we're not talking about anything pedophilic or whatever, but it's still like in the realm of something sexually abusive, right? Where you can imagine one of their political opponents saying, "You were so gung ho about denouncing the Epstein class and saying Trump is implicated in something or other because of Epstein, blah 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 blah, and yet you somehow were suspiciously late or quiet about rooting this kind of stuff out in your own party." That could be the line, right? So I don't know, in terms of like how to just kind of generally classify what era we're in now. I think it's not quite Me Too. It's like it's something else.
I think it's floundering. I think it's floundering. There are now 8 Democrats who are vying to take his position and run in the as the Democratic candidate, and at least 3 or 4 of them have already lost and dropped out from other races in the past. So that doesn't seem like that's that exciting.
Michael, do you feel like there's a boy who cried wolf syndrome here, meaning that is part of the reason you're so riled up about these accusations of pedophilia and rape, because you really realize how terrible rape and pedophilia is. And when there's all these false accusations going around, it diminishes the likelihood that when there's legitimate accusation to be made, that people will pay attention. Is that part of what motivates you to speak out?
Well, I mean, I obviously agree that rape is a serious crime. Like, but the thing is, there's been such concept creep around it, or it's been so expanded beyond recognition in terms of like what we're supposed to agree is rape. Same with pedophilia, right? Like pedophilia now, I guess, is like anybody who somebody thinks is like too young of a woman for somebody to be interested in. Like, it's not
right.
No, forget the clinical definition that you can go and read in the DSM, which is like illicit sexual attraction to or activity with prepubescent children. Like, that's why the term pedophilia was coined. No, forget it. That's been obliterated definitionally, and like pedophilia is like in the eye of the beholder in terms of what people want to denounce moralistically. So I think, I think it's bad if like now like we've just invented hugely expansive new categories of people who could be tarnished with the label of pedophilia. Right. or as having committed rape. I mean, look in the main criminal code as to what the crime of I think it's gross sexual assault, if I'm not mistaken. Basically whatever the equivalent of rape would be for statutory purposes. Like, what that crime is punishable by up to 30 years in prison, lifetime registration on the sex offender registry, and then also that doesn't even take into account all the social, reputational, professional repercussions that would flow from somebody being convicted or even charged with a crime like that. So I think if people are just so blasé about it and think it's like no big deal if it gets like operationalized because the deadline to replace a Senate candidate is coming up in 6 days. I mean, that's kind of craven, isn't it? That's not something you necessarily want to encourage the quote normalization of. Otherwise, like, you're just, and again, I think allowing just kind of unchallenged sort of mob behavior like this to go on without anybody pausing for a second to contemplate anything is itself damaging. Like, I mean, the Epstein thing unleashed unbelievable, unfathomable quantities of just pure hysteria in the population that it's going to have impact that are difficult to kind of like quite quantify for ages. The school picture day thing is just like one example, right?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Forget like actual legal changes that have been on the books, where like now they've expanded the contours of what kind of sex trafficking is, so that like, I don't want to get down that rabbit hole, but like basically they're supposedly the big remedy for the injustice of Epstein is to enable prosecutors to charge a greater expanse of offenses under the rubric of trafficking. So, in other words, throw more people in prison more easily, and have less of a burden of proof. So, like in Arizona, for example, in June, they passed a law, signed by Katie Hobbs, where anybody who engages in or attempts to solicit a quote unquote commercial sex act in any way, so basically a classic prostitution thing, right? Now they're essentially being labeled traffickers, meaning that they're victimizing a sex trafficking victim, and also it's an instant felony record, and they have to pay money into a trafficking prevention fund, as though they've been found guilty of trafficking for basically as little as going on to like an escort service website and offering to pay for a particular sex act. I'm not condoning that or endorsing it necessarily.
But you're saying whether or not they knew that the young woman had been trafficked.
Whether or not somebody has been trafficked is so amorphous and so open to interpretation that you can basically just claim it. But it doesn't even matter, because whether or not there is like whether or not the person from whom you're soliciting the sex act, the commercial sex act, is claiming to be a trafficking victim, it doesn't matter. Even if it's a woman who says, I'm not trafficked, I'm just an escort. No, if caught and convicted for the offense, you still have to pay money into a fund set up by the state of Arizona for trafficking awareness. So what does that therefore carry the connotation of, that you did something that you have to atone for in terms of like trafficking, right? So this is just like one of many examples I could give of how the Epstein sort of mania that, in some sense ties into this Platner stuff or Swallow or whatever, it has all these legal, political, and social downstream consequences that are not perceptible to the average person when they're giving themselves over to these frenzies, because they think it's just about achieving some narrow political objective of getting somebody else on the ballot before July 13th or whatever.
All right, and you'll be discussing these issues in person on July 14th at the Sheen Center in New York. Do you know the format of the debate, or you're just going to show up and swing?
Yeah, I mean, it's an Oxford-style debate, so it's modeled on the classic Oxford style, where there's a moderator, a lot of time for like opening statements, and then rebuttal and so forth, and then the audience votes afterwards. Meaning, the audience comes in, they initially they record who they would tend to agree with more going into it, and then whoever moves a greater percentage of the audience to their side at the end is the winner.
All right. And if people want to keep up with your work, the best place is your Substack, mtracey.net. That's Tracey with an E, mtracey.net. And correct. On X, they can follow you at mtracey. And you occasionally write for other publications too, like right here, Unheard.
Yeah, there we go. I mean, I was asked to do an emergency Platner thing after the New York Times article. Yeah, I occasionally write for other places, but the best place to get it all is mtracey.net. Very importantly with the E, so thanks for mentioning that. And Twitter X, and then YouTube, which I don't update quite as much, but it's mtracey there as well.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Michael. We've been hoping to get you on for a while. You're an interesting guy, and you're welcome anytime.
Thanks,
All
Michael.
right, thanks. I enjoyed it. Take care.
All right, glad. And thanks to you, Ryan, and to our beloved audience. We'll see you all next week at the usual time. Good night, everybody.
That ended abruptly.